Nathan Walker had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without allowing emotion to alter a single decision. Yet 3 seconds before signing his divorce decree, he noticed his pregnant wife quietly remove her wedding ring and hide it inside a sealed envelope bearing a surname he had never seen. The envelope rested beneath Zaria Bennett's left hand, half covered by the cream sleeve of her dress, and although Nathan could read only the embossed letter W, the court clerk's reaction suggested she recognized far more. Zaria caught the clerk staring, slid the envelope into her handbag, and placed one protective palm over the gentle curve of her unborn child, as though guarding 2 secrets instead of 1. Nathan could still have asked a final question, but pride had already persuaded him that another unanswered question would merely prolong a marriage that silence had slowly hollowed out. He signed his name beneath hers, unaware that the concealed envelope contained evidence proving she had intended to tell him everything the following morning. Rain streaked the tall windows of the Boston family courtroom, while Judge Marjorie Hale reviewed the settlement with the weary patience of someone who had watched too many couples mistake certainty for understanding. Nathan sat beside his attorney in a tailored navy suit, his posture controlled, while Zaria remained across the aisle with no jewelry, no visible anger, and no demand for any portion of his considerable wealth. She had waived spousal support, declined ownership in the Cambridge townhouse, and requested only a structured parenting agreement after their baby's birth, choices Nathan interpreted as proof she had prepared to leave long before he understood their marriage was ending. Yet Zaria's calmness did not resemble relief. It resembled someone enduring a consequence she had predicted but had been powerless to prevent. When Judge Hale asked whether reconciliation remained possible, Zaria looked directly at Nathan, waited for him to meet her eyes, then answered only after he lowered his gaze toward the unsigned decree. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, despite the slight pressure of her fingers against the edge of the table. "A marriage cannot survive when one person needs immediate answers and the other is legally forbidden to provide them." Nathan's attorney glanced toward him, but Nathan remained still because he had heard variations of that explanation for nearly a year, usually after mysterious calls or unexplained meetings interrupted what had once been a peaceful life. Zaria had repeatedly insisted that her silence protected people beyond herself, yet she had refused to provide names, dates, or even enough context for Nathan to distinguish duty from deception. He had never discovered an affair, hidden debt, or dishonest transaction, but suspicion had filled every space where facts were missing, until imagination became more persuasive than the woman he had promised to trust. Judge Hale studied them both, then warned that legal finality often arrived long before emotional clarity, although neither of them responded. Their marriage had not collapsed through shouting, betrayal, or one unforgivable act. It had weakened during ordinary evenings when Nathan returned from work and found Zaria ending calls as he entered the room. Several envelopes carrying court seals had arrived under unfamiliar names, and once, after midnight, he had overheard her tell an older woman that the child changes everything. Zaria later explained that the conversation concerned a family matter, but when Nathan asked whether the child meant their unborn baby, she had closed her eyes and requested 48 more hours. The next morning, a private investigator, Nathan's corporate attorney, had quietly retained delivered photographs showing Zaria entering a coastal estate with Eleanor Whitmore, the reclusive chairwoman of one of New England's oldest charitable foundations. Nathan confronted Zaria with the photographs, and when she refused to explain the relationship, he filed for divorce before the 48 hours expired. Now, as the judge offered them one final opportunity to reconsider, Nathan remembered Zaria standing in their kitchen with those photographs trembling between her hands, not because she appeared guilty, but because something inside her had broken when she realized he had investigated her. She had asked whether he truly believed she was capable of building a secret life behind his back, and instead of answering, Nathan had demanded the truth, as though love were a deposition and trust could be restored through compelled testimony. Zaria had whispered that the truth was coming, but Nathan replied that a truth delivered only after surveillance was no longer honesty. Within an hour, she packed one suitcase, left her house keys beside the fruit bowl, and moved into the apartment she had maintained for her legal aid work. Neither of them understood that the investigators' report had omitted the only fact that mattered. Eleanor Whitmore was not Zaria's lover, employer, or secret benefactor, but the court-appointed guardian of an identity protected since infancy. Judge Hale signed the decree at 11:17, and the muted sound of her pen crossing paper seemed louder than the rain against the windows. Zaria accepted her certified copy, stood carefully, and paused beside Nathan long enough for him to notice exhaustion beneath the composure she had worn throughout the hearing. "I hope our child never learns that silence always means guilt," she said quietly, without accusation or cruelty. Nathan wanted to answer that children also deserved honesty, yet the words felt smaller than they had during every argument preceding this moment. Zaria touched the closed handbag containing her wedding ring and the Whitmore envelope, then walked through the courtroom doors without looking back. Nathan exited through the public entrance several minutes later, expecting to feel the clean relief that followed difficult decisions, but the afternoon air carried only the strange emptiness of something completed incorrectly. Near the curb, a black sedan waited beside Eleanor Whitmore, whom Nathan recognized from the investigators' photographs, despite having never met her. The distinguished woman stepped forward, took Zaria's overnight bag, and embraced her with a tenderness too intimate to be professional, while Zaria briefly allowed her forehead to rest against Eleanor's shoulder. "The court released the final seal this morning," Eleanor murmured. "You do not have to be Zaria Bennett alone anymore." Zaria straightened, glanced toward the courthouse, and answered, "Bennett is the name my parents gave me, but Whitmore is the truth." Nathan never waited long enough to hear. Nathan stopped beneath the courthouse awning as the two women entered the sedan, and for the first time since filing for divorce, certainty abandoned him completely. Before the door closed, Eleanor handed Zaria the same sealed envelope he had noticed beside the decree, and the full inscription became visible through the rain-darkened glass. It read, "For Nathan Walker, to be opened only after he chooses understanding over accusation." The sedan disappeared into downtown traffic before Nathan could move, leaving him alone with the knowledge that Zaria had prepared an explanation before their marriage ended. What he did not yet know was why a judge had sealed her identity for 30 years, why the Whitmore family had erased her from every public record, or why his own company's confidential acquisition files had become the final reason she remained silent. Nathan returned to Walker Capital expecting work to silence his doubts, but the view from his corner office overlooking Boston Harbor only reminded him of how often Zaria had watched the same water while asking him to slow down. His executive assistant, Claire Morrison, had redirected a small stack of personal mail from the townhouse, most of it routine, except for a cream envelope carrying no postage, return address, or recognizable delivery mark. Across the front, written in deliberate blue ink, were 6 words that tightened something behind his ribs. "You deserve the truth much sooner." Claire explained that an elderly courier had delivered it by hand, refusing to identify herself while insisting Nathan should read it privately. He waited until the office door closed before opening the envelope, although hesitation felt unfamiliar to a man who had built his career by deciding faster than everyone around him. The unsigned letter contained no dramatic confession, only a warning that dismantled his assumptions more effectively than any accusation could have done. It stated that Zaria's silence had been governed by a court order, a fiduciary agreement, and an unresolved conflict involving property Walker Capital intended to purchase along the Maine coast. Revealing her identity before the court lifted its seal might have exposed protected beneficiaries, compromised the settlement, and allowed competitors to accuse Nathan's company of receiving privileged information through marriage. The writer emphasized that Zaria had requested permission to tell him once she learned she was pregnant, and the court had scheduled a final hearing exactly 48 hours after Nathan confronted her with the investigators' photographs. Nathan read that sentence repeatedly, remembering how she had begged for 2 days while he accused her of buying time to improve a lie. Beneath the letter rested a brass key attached to a faded leather tag, stamped with the number 214 and the name Harbor Trust Depository. A handwritten note instructed Nathan to collect the contents alone, listen before judging, and resist using his attorneys or security team to investigate anyone connected to Zaria. The request exposed an uncomfortable truth about him, because his first instinct had already been to call Walker Capital's general counsel and demand a complete background report on every Whitmore family trust. Instead, he placed the key inside his pocket, canceled an investor meeting, and searched his archived corporate files for the coastal acquisition mentioned in the letter. Within minutes, he found Project Meridian, a proposed purchase of abandoned shipyard property intended for a luxury waterfront development, and discovered that the seller was a subsidiary indirectly controlled by the Whitmore Foundation. Nathan had approved preliminary negotiations 6 months earlier, during the exact period when Zaria's private meetings became more frequent and their arguments intensified. The project files showed that public records listed the land as commercially available, yet several internal memoranda warned that unresolved charitable restrictions might prevent redevelopment. Nathan's chief financial officer, Daniel Cross, had dismissed those concerns as procedural obstacles and repeatedly encouraged Nathan to close the transaction before competing developers recognized the site's value. More troubling was an email Daniel had sent the morning after Nathan hired the private investigator, claiming an unnamed source suggested Zaria possessed undisclosed ties to the Whitmore Foundation. Nathan had accepted Daniel's concern as professional caution, never questioning how his chief financial officer learned about Zaria's private meetings before the investigator completed his report. At 9 o'clock the following morning, Nathan entered Harbor Trust Depository, where polished marble floors and silent brass doors reflected a century of discretion rather than display. An employee examined the key, verified an authorization bearing Zaria's signature, and escorted him through secured corridors to locker 214. Inside waited a cedar box containing no money or jewelry, only a folded baby blanket, an old photo album, several letters tied with blue ribbon, and a sealed message addressed to Nathan. The first photograph showed 8-year-old Zaria standing beside Eleanor Whitmore at a coastal estate, while another pictured her between David and Angela Bennett, the black couple she had always described as her parents. Beneath the photograph, someone had written, "3 people loved her enough to let her choose which name would define her." The album revealed a childhood divided between ordinary family life and carefully supervised visits to Whitmore Point, where Zaria attended private foundation events without appearing in official photographs or published guest lists. She was shown reading to children, planting beach grass after storms, and helping Angela Bennett organize legal files for families facing eviction, experiences that explained her devotion to community law far more clearly than hidden privilege ever could. A newspaper clipping described Eleanor Whitmore's creation of a public justice foundation. Yet no article mentioned Zaria or explained why she appeared beside judges, trustees, and child advocates throughout the accompanying photographs. Nathan then found the silver locket, opened it, and discovered a tiny handwritten note folded behind Zaria's childhood portrait. "When the truth becomes safe, tell her who she really is, but never let the name become more important than the people who raised her." The sealed letter from Zaria began without blame, which made every sentence more difficult for Nathan to endure. She explained that David and Angela Bennett were her legal parents, emotional foundation, and chosen family, while the Whitmore connection represented a biological history entangled with a contested charitable trust. The court had protected her identity because several distant heirs once attempted to challenge the trust by arguing that any undisclosed descendant might alter control of valuable coastal property. Although those claims had weakened over time, Zaria remained bound by confidentiality until the final judicial review, particularly after Walker Capital expressed interest in land held by the same trust. She had feared that revealing herself to Nathan would force him either to withdraw from the project at enormous cost or continue while facing accusations that his marriage provided access unavailable to competitors. Nathan lowered the letter when he reached the final paragraph, where Zaria described the conversation he had overheard about their unborn child. She had told Eleanor that pregnancy changed everything because she refused to let another generation inherit uncertainty about its own family history. Eleanor petitioned the court for emergency permission, and Judge Hale scheduled the release hearing for the Friday after Nathan's confrontation. Zaria had planned to explain everything that Saturday morning, but Nathan filed for divorce on Thursday and refused every request to postpone the decision. Tucked behind the letter was an appointment card for a harbor cafe bearing Eleanor's name and the following morning's date, along with one final sentence in Zaria's handwriting. Before you decide whether I deceived you, ask who benefited when you stopped trusting me. Sea mist covered Boston Harbor when Nathan arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, carrying Zaria's letter inside his jacket, and a growing suspicion he could no longer dismiss. Eleanor Whitmore entered precisely at 10, wearing a simple gray coat and carrying no assistants, security personnel, or visible symbol of the influence attached to her name. She sat across from Nathan, removed her gloves, and studied him with neither hostility nor sympathy, as though deciding whether remorse had made him honest or merely desperate. Nathan placed Daniel Cross's email beside the appointment card and asked whether his chief financial officer had known Zaria's identity before the divorce. Eleanor's expression changed almost imperceptibly, confirming the possibility before she spoke a word. Daniel knew enough to recognize her connection, but not enough to understand the legal protections surrounding it, Eleanor said, keeping her voice low as commuters passed behind them. 3 years earlier, Daniel had represented an investment group competing for development rights on the same coastal property later targeted by Walker Capital, and his group lost after the foundation preserved the land for public use. When Daniel joined Nathan's company, he revived the proposal under Project Meridian, believing Nathan's reputation and financial strength could overcome restrictions that had defeated earlier buyers. Zaria discovered the acquisition accidentally after seeing a site map on Nathan's desk, then immediately disclosed the conflict to Eleanor and withdrew from every foundation discussion concerning the property. Because the court seal remained active, she could not explain why the project threatened her family responsibilities without revealing protected information. Nathan remembered an evening when Zaria asked whether success justified transforming every beautiful place into something profitable, a question he had dismissed as sentimental resistance to development. He now understood. She had been searching for a way to challenge the project without violating the court's restrictions, or influencing his business through undisclosed family ties. Eleanor explained that Zaria requested an independent ethics review, hoping neutral counsel could advise Nathan without identifying her, but Daniel learned of the inquiry and warned that someone close to Nathan might be undermining the acquisition. He then recommended the private investigator framed Zaria's meetings as potential disloyalty and provided enough accurate details to make his speculation appear credible. Daniel had not invented Zaria's silence, but he had carefully interpreted it in the manner most likely to destroy Nathan's trust. Eleanor slid a certified court document across the table, explaining that the final seal had expired the previous week, after judges rejected the remaining challenges to the trust. The record confirmed that Zaria had been born to a Whitmore descendant who died shortly after childbirth, leaving a vulnerable infant at the center of inheritance disputes she could never have understood. David and Angela Bennett, respected public interest attorneys and Eleanor's closest friends, adopted Zaria through a protected proceeding designed to separate her upbringing from money, publicity, and litigation. Eleanor remained trustee only because the court required someone to preserve Zaria's future rights until she could choose whether to accept or renounce them. When Zaria became an adult, she accepted responsibility for the foundation's public interest mission, but refused personal access to its wealth, continuing to use Bennett because love, not biology, had made it her home. Nathan asked why Zaria had not simply withdrawn from the trust entirely, freeing herself to tell him everything, but Eleanor's answer exposed another assumption he had never considered. Zaria's withdrawal would have transferred control to distant relatives, eager to sell protected coastal land, reduce legal aid funding, and convert charitable assets into private development opportunities. Remaining connected was not an act of ambition. It preserved scholarships, community clinics, and shoreline protections, serving thousands of people who would never know her name. The secret meetings Nathan resented were unpaid trustee consultations, and the legal envelopes he treated as evidence of betrayal concerned programs Zaria had quietly protected while living on her own modest salary. She had carried a burden of wealth without enjoying its privileges, while Nathan had judged her through the very status assumptions she had spent her life resisting. Eleanor then placed an ultrasound photograph beside the court records, and Zaria's handwriting on the back nearly erased Nathan's remaining defenses. "Tomorrow I will finally tell Nathan everything, because our child deserves a family built without sealed doors." The date was one day before he received the investigator's photographs, and attached to the image was a draft letter requesting that Walker Capital voluntarily withdraw from Project Meridian once Zaria disclosed the conflict. She had intended to offer no legal demand and no threat. She wanted Nathan to choose preservation, after understanding what the property funded and whom the acquisition would displace. Daniel, however, had accelerated the confrontation, because disclosure would likely end the deal and expose his concealed financial interest in the development consortium positioned to profit from resale. Nathan felt anger rise, but Eleanor stopped him before it hardened into another impulsive decision. "Do not replace one certainty with another," she warned. "Daniel's conduct must be investigated properly, and regret does not entitle you to storm into Zaria's life demanding reconciliation." Nathan understood that she was not protecting him from Daniel, but from the part of himself that still believed action could erase consequences. He asked where Zaria had gone, and Eleanor refused to provide the address, explaining that pregnancy had already carried enough emotional strain, and Zaria needed peace rather than another confrontation. If Nathan wished to become trustworthy, he would have to begin without reward, apology accepted in advance, or assurance that the family he lost would return. Before leaving, Eleanor gave him one final envelope containing the independent ethics review Zaria had commissioned months earlier. Its conclusion warned that Project Meridian posed serious reputational and legal risks, even without considering Zaria's identity, because the redevelopment depended upon challenging restrictions clearly intended to preserve public access. Daniel had removed the report from Nathan's executive briefing packet and replaced it with a shortened summary claiming no material obstacle existed. Nathan stared through the cafe window toward the harbor, recognizing that his marriage and company had been endangered by the same weakness. He rewarded confident answers more readily than inconvenient questions. He had not divorced Zaria because she lacked integrity. He had divorced her because another man understood how easily Nathan's impatience could be weaponized against the person who knew him best. Nathan returned to Walker Capital without confronting Daniel, because Eleanor's warning remained clearer than the anger urging him toward immediate accusation. He instructed outside counsel to conduct an independent review of Project Meridian, preserving every email, financial disclosure, and communication involving Daniel's former investment group. Rather than reveal what Eleanor had told him, Nathan described potential conflicts discovered during a routine governance assessment, allowing investigators to determine whether evidence supported his suspicions. Daniel responded with practiced confidence, insisting the project represented Walker Capital's most valuable expansion opportunity and warning that hesitation would allow competitors to acquire the land. For the first time, Nathan heard the manipulation beneath the certainty, because it sounded painfully similar to the voice he had used when demanding Zaria explain herself immediately. The investigation uncovered no elaborate criminal conspiracy, but the truth was damaging precisely because it rested upon ordinary ambition, concealed incentives, and decisions rationalized one compromise at a time. Daniel held an undisclosed profit-sharing agreement with a consulting company advising the development consortium, meaning he would benefit if Walker Capital acquired the land and later transferred construction rights. He had also withheld the independent ethics report, pressured analysts to minimize litigation risk, and shared selective information about Zaria with the investigator Nathan's attorney retained. Although Daniel claimed he merely protected the company from a possible conflict involving Nathan's wife, his messages showed repeated efforts to portray Zaria's secrecy as personal betrayal rather than legal restraint. He never fabricated photographs or documents, but he arranged the fragments so Nathan would build the most destructive interpretation himself. At the emergency board meeting, Nathan presented the findings without protecting his own reputation, admitting that he approved the investigation into Zaria and allowed personal distrust to influence corporate judgment. Several directors expected him to distance himself from Daniel's conduct, Yet Nathan accepted responsibility for creating an environment where speed, loyalty, and financial confidence mattered more than dissenting evidence. Daniel was removed pending regulatory review. Project Meridian was terminated, and Walker Capital voluntarily disclosed the undisclosed financial arrangement to appropriate authorities. Nathan also announced that the company would fund restoration of the shipyard property without seeking ownership, placing the land under an independent coastal trust. The decision cost millions in preliminary expenses, but Nathan understood that consequences could not become meaningful only when someone else paid them. News of the withdrawal reached Zaria through Foundation Counsel, yet she offered no message of gratitude and made no request to see Nathan. Her silence now felt different, because Nathan no longer treated it as a challenge demanding conquest. He recognized her right to decide when contact felt safe. He sent one letter through Eleanor, apologizing without defending his fear, mentioning Daniel, or using the investigation to prove he had changed. He wrote that Zaria had given him years of observable character, while he allowed several months of missing information to outweigh everything he knew about her. He promised to respect every boundary concerning the baby and enclosed a proposed parenting agreement granting Zaria primary decision-making authority until trust could be evaluated through consistent behavior. Weeks passed without a reply, and Nathan began making changes no one had requested because he finally understood that transformation performed for an audience was merely negotiation. He reduced his travel schedule, delegated authority to executives he had previously micromanaged, and spent Friday afternoons volunteering at the community legal clinic where Zaria once served. At first, he performed simple tasks such as sorting forms, preparing coffee, and guiding visitors toward interpreters, duties that offered no prestige and required patience he had rarely practiced. He listened to parents describe employment disputes, housing emergencies, and custody fears that could not be solved by writing a check or making one decisive call. Their lives reminded him that uncertainty was not always deception. Sometimes it was the unavoidable condition of people carrying responsibilities larger than themselves. One evening, while clearing storage cabinets, Nathan found a box labeled Bennett Family Outreach, containing legal education materials developed by David and Angela before their deaths. The clinic director explained that the Bennetts had trained young attorneys to begin every consultation with a simple instruction: listen long enough for the client's real problem to emerge. Zaria had continued their program, personally funding transportation vouchers while refusing public recognition from the Whitmore Foundation. Nathan realized that the patience he once interpreted as evasiveness had been the central discipline of her life, inherited from parents who believed dignity began when people were heard completely. He had loved that quality when it benefited him, then condemned it when it required something difficult from him. 3 months after the divorce, Eleanor invited Nathan to the Whitmore Foundation's annual scholarship ceremony, making clear that he would attend only as an ordinary guest and should not approach Zaria unless she approached him. The gathering filled a restored harbor library with students, teachers, and families, while Nathan remained near the rear beneath a balcony where few people noticed him. Halfway through the program, Zaria stepped onto the stage wearing a navy maternity dress, her pregnancy now unmistakable, and spoke about children deserving identities shaped by character rather than inherited expectation. She thanked the Bennetts for teaching her that family was not the place where every fact arrived easily, but the place where love made patience possible while truth found its safest form. Nathan applauded with everyone else, although her words left him unable to hide the grief moving across his face. After the ceremony, guests gathered in the garden beneath maple trees burning gold and crimson in the autumn light. Nathan remained beside the library doors until Zaria noticed him across the lawn, and for several seconds neither of them moved. She walked toward him slowly, not with warmth or hostility, but with the caution of someone approaching a place where the ground had once collapsed. Nathan thanked her for allowing his attendance, then told her he would not ask forgiveness, reconciliation, or access beyond what she believed healthy for their child. Zaria studied him carefully and replied that understanding his mistake was not the same as becoming incapable of repeating it, because genuine change required proof across ordinary days, especially when fear returned. "I know," Nathan said, keeping a respectful distance while their child shifted beneath her hand. "That is why I am not asking you to believe anything I say today." Zaria's eyes softened, although sadness remained within them, and she explained that the baby was due in 6 weeks at a hospital near the Maine coast. She would provide medical updates through her attorney and permit Nathan to attend the birth if he respected every boundary established beforehand. Nathan agreed without negotiating a single condition, and when Zaria turned toward the waterfront path, she allowed him to walk beside her for several minutes. They did not discuss rebuilding their marriage. They discussed the kind of parents they hoped to become, which was the first honest future they had shared since silence began dividing them. 6 weeks later, Nathan was reviewing clinic intake forms when Zaria's attorney called to say she had entered labor earlier than expected during a coastal storm. The drive to Maine required nearly 3 hours under ordinary conditions, but heavy rain had flooded sections of the highway and slowed traffic to a cautious crawl. Nathan felt the old impulse to solve the delay through influence, private aircraft or police assistance. Yet the storm had grounded local flights, and emergency services were already occupied protecting vulnerable communities. He called the hospital only once, confirmed Zaria was stable, and resisted demanding further information from nurses who had responsibilities more urgent than calming him. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Nathan faced an outcome he could neither accelerate nor control, and chose not to punish anyone for that helplessness. When he reached the hospital shortly after midnight, Eleanor waited near the maternity entrance with rain still shining on her gray coat. She explained that Zaria had experienced complications related to elevated blood pressure, but the medical team had stabilized both mother and baby. Nathan's face must have revealed panic because Eleanor touched his sleeve and reminded him that fear did not grant permission to take control away from the person enduring the crisis. Zaria had approved his presence, although she wanted Eleanor beside her during delivery, and requested that Nathan remain near the head of the bed without questioning medical decisions. He accepted every condition immediately, then removed his soaked jacket and entered the room only after a nurse confirmed Zaria still wanted him there. Zaria looked exhausted, frightened, and more vulnerable than Nathan had ever seen her. Yet her first concern involved whether he had driven recklessly through the storm. Nathan assured her he had arrived carefully, then stood where the nurse directed and offered his hand, without assuming she would take it. During another contraction, Zaria reached for him with unexpected strength, and Nathan remained quiet while she followed the physician's instructions. No apology belonged in that room, no explanation could compete with the work her body was performing, and no promise mattered more than his ability to remain steady, without making the moment about his regret. After nearly 2 difficult hours, their daughter entered the world crying loudly enough to fill the room with relief. The nurse placed the baby against Zaria's chest, and Nathan watched emotions pass across her face that language could not responsibly reduce to joy alone. There was relief, exhaustion, grief for the family they might have been, and wonder at the child who had arrived, despite every fracture surrounding her. Zaria looked toward Nathan and whispered that they had chosen the name Hope Angela Bennett Walker, honoring the mother who raised her while preserving both parents' names without allowing either legacy to erase the other. Nathan repeated the name carefully, understanding that even this choice embodied the balance Zaria had spent her life protecting. When the nurse invited him closer, he touched one tiny hand with a single finger and promised nothing aloud, because he had finally learned that vows spoken before proof could become another form of pressure. Over the following days, Nathan stayed in a nearby hotel rather than assuming access to Zaria's temporary coastal home. He visited during agreed hours, changed diapers under a nurse's guidance, prepared bottles when Zaria needed rest, and left whenever she appeared tired. He never photographed Hope for corporate friends or announced her birth publicly, respecting Zaria's wish that their daughter grow without becoming part of any family narrative she had not chosen. Eleanor observed him carefully, but offered neither praise nor criticism, while Zaria measured change through smaller details. Whether he arrived on time, listened to instructions, accepted correction, and remained patient when plans shifted unexpectedly. Nathan discovered that fatherhood consisted less of grand protection than repeated acts of presence no one applauded. Several months passed, and co-parenting gradually replaced the careful formality that had defined their first weeks after Hope's birth. Nathan rented a modest house 15 minutes away, converting one room into a nursery without recreating the abandoned design in Cambridge or assuming Zaria would eventually move there. He attended pediatric appointments when invited, learned Hope's sleeping patterns, and continued volunteering at the clinic even after the board investigation ended. When business emergencies conflicted with parenting time, he delegated work rather than expecting Zaria to rearrange her life around his schedule. These choices did not erase the divorce, but they created evidence that Nathan's priorities had changed beyond the temporary intensity of remorse. One winter afternoon, Zaria arrived at Nathan's house to collect Hope and discovered him asleep in the rocking chair, with their daughter resting safely against his chest. A legal aid manual lay open beside him, marked with notes for a training program he had helped the clinic expand through an anonymous donation. Zaria covered Hope with a blanket, then noticed a framed photograph on the shelf showing David and Angela Bennett beside young Zaria. Nathan had requested a copy from Eleanor, not to display the Whitmore history, but to ensure Hope grew up seeing the grandparents whose values shaped her mother. When he woke, Zaria asked why he had never mentioned the clinic program, and Nathan answered that meaningful work did not require her knowledge to become meaningful. The response unsettled Zaria more deeply than a polished apology would have done, because it reflected the lesson she had once believed he might never understand. She sat across from him, while snow gathered beyond the windows, and admitted that part of her still loved the man he had been before suspicion changed their home. Another part feared that reconciliation would reward remorse before trust had fully healed, leaving both of them vulnerable to repeating the same pattern under future pressure. Nathan told her love did not obligate her to return, and he would continue becoming a better father whether their relationship changed or remained permanently separate. Zaria looked toward Hope, sleeping peacefully, and said that perhaps trust did not return as a restored building. Perhaps it returned as new rooms constructed carefully beside the ruins. She invited Nathan to dinner the following Sunday, not as her husband, partner, or forgiven former spouse, but as someone she wished to know again without secrecy, investigation, or assumptions. Nathan accepted, without asking what the invitation meant, although Hope moved quietly through him, with a gentleness he had never experienced during any corporate victory. Before leaving, Zaria placed a small envelope on the table, explaining that it contained the wedding ring she had sealed inside the courthouse. Nathan did not open it because she had written a condition across the front. "Keep this only until we decide whether it represents an ending, a lesson, or a promise worth making differently." He placed the envelope in a drawer beside Hope's birth certificate, understanding that some answers became trustworthy only after no one tried to force them. Their Sunday dinners continued through the winter, first with Eleanor present, later with Hope sleeping between them, and eventually as quiet evenings where Nathan and Zaria discussed fears they once concealed behind certainty or patience. Zaria admitted that legal restrictions had explained her silence, but did not excuse every choice she made because she could have communicated more clearly about the emotional burden even when specific facts remained protected. She had treated patience as something Nathan should provide without understanding how years of unexplained absences affected him, especially while Project Meridian created tensions she could not name. Nathan acknowledged that uncertainty had frightened him, but fear became destructive only when he elevated suspicion above her demonstrated character. Neither accepted complete blame, yet neither used shared responsibility to reduce the seriousness of personal failure. They began counseling with a therapist experienced in rebuilding trust after divorce, approaching each session without assuming remarriage was the intended outcome. Nathan learned to ask what Zaria could safely share instead of demanding everything she could not, while Zaria practiced distinguishing privacy from emotional withdrawal. They established a rule that neither would investigate, infer, or make irreversible decisions during moments of fear, without first allowing a complete conversation and reasonable time for reflection. The rule sounded simple, but both understood its difficulty, because their marriage had ended precisely when urgency felt more trustworthy than patience. Progress arrived through ordinary disagreements handled differently, each one proving that conflict no longer had to become accusation or retreat. Meanwhile, the independent investigation into Project Meridian concluded with Daniel Cross barred from executive service under a regulatory settlement and required to surrender the undisclosed financial benefits he had expected to receive. Nathan declined opportunities to portray Daniel as the sole architect of the disaster, publicly accepting responsibility for approving a culture where inconvenient reports could be buried beneath confident projections. Walker Capital adopted new conflict review procedures, protected internal dissent, and separated executive compensation from transactions dependent upon contested public assets. The abandoned shipyard was transferred into a non-profit coastal trust, while restoration plans included affordable maritime training, public shoreline access, and research facilities supported jointly by Walker Capital and the Whitmore Foundation. Zaria participated only after an independent board confirmed that neither she nor Nathan controlled the project alone. On the first anniversary of their divorce, Nathan and Zaria returned to the courthouse, not for another legal proceeding, but because Judge Hale had invited them to speak privately after learning how the sealed case had intersected with their marriage. The judge explained that courts could protect identities and property interests, yet no order could teach couples how to survive the emotional consequences of necessary secrecy. Zaria thanked her for lifting the seal when the legal risk finally ended, while Nathan admitted he once mistook access to facts for entitlement to another person's entire history. Judge Hale reminded them that reconciliation should never be treated as proof that suffering was worthwhile, because some relationships healed through reunion while others healed through respectful separation. What mattered was whether both people became safer, wiser, and more honest than they had been before. After leaving the courthouse, they walked beneath the same awning where Nathan had overheard the Whitmore name 1 year earlier. Hope rested against his chest in a carrier, watching passing cars with wide, curious eyes, while Zaria stood beside him beneath a clear spring sky. Nathan removed the sealed envelope containing the wedding ring and offered it back without opening it, explaining that the decision could belong only to her. Zaria held the envelope for a long moment, then tore it carefully along the edge and allowed the ring to fall into her palm. The metal carried no magical power, yet it held the history of promises made sincerely, broken painfully, and reconsidered with greater humility. "I do not want our old marriage back," Zaria said, looking toward the courthouse doors rather than Nathan. "That marriage required me to hide too much and allowed you to decide too quickly, so returning to it would only honor the parts that failed us." Nathan nodded, although disappointment briefly tightened his chest, because he had promised himself her answer would not become another problem he tried to solve. Zaria then turned toward him and explained that she wanted something new, built by two people who understood that love did not eliminate boundaries, uncertainty, or fear. She was willing to consider remarriage only after another full year of counseling, co-parenting, and shared decisions made without pressure from family, business, or public expectation. Nathan accepted the condition before asking whether she felt certain, then stopped himself and smiled at the old instinct hidden within the question. Zaria smiled as well, recognizing the effort, and slipped the ring into her coat pocket rather than placing it on her finger. They spent the next year creating the life neither wealth nor regret could manufacture quickly, celebrating Hope's first steps, visiting the Bennett Legal Clinic, and helping Eleanor establish records preserving both sides of Zaria's history for future generations. Nathan learned that the Whitmore estate mattered less to Zaria than the worn cookbook Angela Bennett had filled with handwritten notes, while Zaria learned that Nathan's need for clarity often came from fear of losing the people he loved, rather than a desire to control them. Understanding did not erase harm, but it gave them tools to stop harm from becoming destiny. 2 years after the divorce, they gathered at the restored shoreline where Project Meridian had once threatened to replace public land with private towers. No reporters attended, no executives delivered speeches, and no historic mansion provided a backdrop, because Zaria wanted their new vows witnessed only by Eleanor, clinic volunteers, several close friends, and Hope. Nathan promised to remember that unanswered questions required conversation rather than judgment, while Zaria promised not to mistake endurance for communication when silence began creating distance. They did not promise never to fail, because both had learned that perfect vows often collapsed under ordinary human fear. Instead, they promised to pause before assuming, listen before deciding, and protect truth without using it as a weapon. When the officiant invited Zaria to exchange rings, she removed the original band from her pocket, where she had carried it throughout the ceremony, but she did not place it on Nathan's hand. She explained that the old ring belonged to the marriage they had lost and should remain evidence of what impatience could destroy. Eleanor handed Hope a small box containing 2 newly made bands, each engraved inside with the same sentence David and Angela Bennett once taught their clients: "Listen until the real story begins." Zaria placed Nathan's ring on his finger, and Nathan did the same for her, while Hope laughed between them as waves moved gently against the restored shore. Years later, Hope would know that her mother had been born into one family, raised by another, and loved through the difficult joining of both histories. She would also know that her parents divorced before her birth, not because love had been absent, but because love without patience became vulnerable to fear, pride, and convenient interpretations. Nathan never described their reunion as fate, since that would have made healing sound inevitable and minimized the disciplined choices Zaria required before trusting him again. He told Hope that her mother's greatest secret had never been the Whitmore name, the sealed trust, or the inheritance she refused to chase. The real secret was that a person could carry several truths at once and still remain completely honest, provided someone loved them patiently enough to hear the whole story. Nathan had once believed signatures created certainty, whether placed beneath contracts, investigations, or divorce decrees. He eventually understood that the most important commitments were written through repeated behavior, especially when no judge, witness, or audience stood nearby to enforce them. Zaria kept the original wedding ring inside the cedar box at Harbor Trust Depository, beside the baby blanket, family photographs, and letters that had revealed the history she once struggled to explain. On top of everything, she added a photograph of Nathan holding Hope on the restored shoreline, then placed a final note beneath it for their daughter to discover when she was old enough. Never judge someone only by the part of their story they were strong enough to survive in silence, but never demand that love survive forever without honest conversation.